Right, greetings, hello, welcome back to the Philosophy Club here in little middle of France, the heartland of the old Gaul. We're surrounded by little villages with menhirs and dolmens, and actually surrounded in this part of La Creuse by oak groves. So when I moved here as a Druid, I totally felt at home. It's a beautiful part of the world, and so I'm using it as a base to do some serious deep thinking and writing and reflecting, and the European Peace Museum is now based here in a very tranquil part of Europe, thank God, which gives us freedom of thought thanks to the French Republican tradition of being, a safe haven for intellectuals. I escaped the madness of Brexit and came here to do some deep thinking and reflecting. So, anyway, welcome to the Philosophy Club, which is on Saturday nights, in fact. So what we're going to do this week is slightly different. We're going to focus on a particular region in the world where religious and indeed philosophical issues they make a sort of maelstrom, if you want. And that's what we call loosely the Middle East. It's a big area. Can be defined variously, but most of the Islamic world, the Jewish community, Israel, it's the origin of Christianity. It's the place where the great Islamic, Jewish, Christian, and some other religions were born, including some pagan religions, which we're going to look at. So we're going to choose, again, the relationships, the tensions between these different traditions, and see if we can shed light on the complex politics of the Middle East through looking at the intellectual traditions. I should say I'm speaking as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East in making this broadcast, so to speak. I'm a philosopher, I'm not a politician, so in a sense I have the luxury of being able to look at this from the etheric realms of higher intellect, and I don't have to be involved in the day-to-day fighting that goes on in the political sphere. Which is messy and complex and difficult for the people involved on all sides. And above me I have the Israeli and the Palestinian flags, both of them here in this room called Apollo. I would love to see a two-state solution to this conflict. And I'm hoping that by looking at it philosophically we can shed some light on all this and get a more mature conversation going. Because too often it's just polarised into almost a sort of bipolar conflict. But as we know from psychiatric studies, bipolar disorder is a problem when things are reduced to a sort of either-or logic. Life is more complex. Life is a rainbow of possibilities. So let's look at these rainbows of choices. And okay, so welcome to the Philosophy Club. Do choose your first couple of traditions, and we'll see what we can find out about them.
All right. What can you tell me about the relation between box 42 and 20?
Right. Box 42 is... okay. That's interesting. Samaritan and Karaite. It's a form of Judaism, and I'll talk about that. So, one of the varieties of Judaism, and then 20 is Phoenician. Ha! Gosh, interesting. Right, well, I'll start with the Phoenician because that's the oldest. And I've talked about this a bit before when I came to talk about Pythagoras, the founder of philosophy, or one of the key figures in it, who was himself half Phoenician. His father was Phoenician. What's so interesting about the Phoenicians? I mean, they were Semitic peoples, very close to the Jews. They were almost blood relatives. The indwelling community, they all spoke what's called a West Semitic dialect, so they had the same language effectively. I think a Phoenician and a Jew would have understood each other. Similar, like a guy from Devon and someone from Essex in England. They've got different dialects of English. And yeah, there are different words, but it's mutually comprehensible. The Phoenicians were the sea dwellers. So they lived in the cities on the coast. And I've been to one of their famous port cities called Dor, which is now a tourist place you can go. And I was sitting there on the walls overlooking the Mediterranean thinking, gosh, this is pretty cool. This is what it was to be a Phoenician. And they had amazing cities called Tyre and Sidon, and another one called Byblos, which were amazing. They were like the New York of the Mediterranean. They were huge trading emporia, where they had great naval fleets of mainly trading ships. They mastered the sea, and they had very sophisticated knowledge of currents, tides, and they mapped the Mediterranean both on the south shore, i.e. North Africa, and the the Greek and North Shore, all the way through Marseille and on to Spain. And they'd founded trading centres there. So Marseille is thought to be a Phoenician foundation down in the south of France. Lisbon is thought to be a Phoenician foundation in Portugal because they went round the bottom tip of the Iberian Peninsula. Cadiz also, in that same part of the Iberian Peninsula. And they founded, also Ibiza was a Phoenician trading centre. It's now a great island for rave and music and dance culture. It was sacred to the god Bes, who was the Egyptian god of song, dance, merrymaking and happiness and family life. He was the god that ordinary people loved the most because he was the god at Saturday night party time. Everyone put on a Bes costume or something and had a dance or 10. And what's interesting is that is what gave its name to Ibiza, which means the place of Bes. Ibesa is how they say it in Spanish. And that came down through the Phoenicians, because the Phoenicians were very eclectic philosophically. Because they travelled all over the Mediterranean, they pinched bits from ancient Egyptian religion. They pinched bits from Druids, who they were quite chummy with. They were trading with the Celts of southern Gaul, and we know that they were quite friendly with them. And so they said, when they got to Ibiza, they said, God, this island's amazing. It must be ruled by Bes, because there's no toxic things like serpents, scorpions. It's just such a paradise island. It's Bes's island. And that was a Phoenician name, borrowed from the Egyptian. And it still resonates. That's why I think all the youngsters of Europe like going to Ibiza for their summer parties and dancing. They're still keeping that tradition alive, whether they know it or not. And there is a cave actually on Ibiza to a Phoenician goddess called Tanith, who was, because they had a pantheon of gods, male and female, like all self-respecting pagan traditions. Byblos was another important town on the coast for the Phoenicians, and it imported papyrus from Egypt. The Phoenicians were very close to ancient Egyptians. And they used the papyrus to make like scrolls. This was the emporium where they made scrolls in the ancient world. It was like a book town, effectively. And so the products that were created were called, in various languages, a bibliothèque in France is the word for a library. It comes from Byblos. It means it's storing the things that come from Byblos, i.e. books, biblia in Greek, and bibliography and all these other words. They come from Byblos, as does the Bible, which is here. We call it the Bible. It's really the writings of the ancient peoples of that region, including, there's quite a few Phoenicians mentioned in this book, as we'll see. And these books were put together as in scroll form in Byblos, and then sent to Egypt and shipped all over the Mediterranean. So that's another gift Phoenicia gave. The most important gift of all, however, what do you put on the parchment scroll? What do you write on the papyrus scroll? You write with letters. in English we use the English alphabet, French alphabet, almost identical. They both come from Latin. Where did the Latin alphabet come from? Well, it came from Etruscan. Where did that come from? Well, it was inspired by Greek alphabets, which in turn were inspired by Phoenician. So the Phoenicians taught the alphabet to the ancient Greeks, which was a huge cultural gift. I mean, incalculably important. So that was the beginning of European literature, poetry that could be written down. So the Homeric epics and so on of Greece that I love, all the literature of Rome, and all the Bibles of the world that are written with an alphabet, we owe it to the Phoenicians who invented this thing. So, yeah, and they were also, I mean, they had a pantheon of gods that was a sort of amalgam of indigenous Canaanite beliefs, which were the Semitic peoples of the inland region. They were the same people as Canaanites. We call them Canaanites if they were living inland, Phoenicians if they were on the ports, but actually identical people. And their pantheon was very similar to the Greek or Egyptian pantheon. So they had a succession of generations of gods who are responsible for everything. And normally the plot line is like the earth goddess marries the sky god, and they have offspring. And Uranos was one of their most important deities. We have some fragments of the Phoenician pantheon that have come down, saved as fragments. And if you're interested, look. If you go into the website of the periodic table, it tells you in more detail. But they were thinking in a sort of pantheon terms of gods and goddesses and succession of generation. So that's the Phoenicians. I mean, really fascinating people. Much more I could say about them, and right down to classical times when, their great era was replaced really by the Greeks, who took over the trade of the North Mediterranean, replacing the Phoenicians, and in the rest of the Mediterranean, the Romans decided to take on the Phoenicians. Rome was quite a militaristic sort of place, and I don't know what it is in human nature that does wars. I personally would have cancelled the war between Rome and Phoenicia and just worked out a peace treaty. It would have been, I think, possible. The Phoenicians came within a whisker of destroying Rome with their great general Hannibal, who marched to Italy with a whole fleet of elephants across the Alps, and he destroyed a couple of Roman armies and was an incredibly powerful general. It's ironic to think that if he'd have actually sacked Rome, which he didn't succeed in doing, we might all be speaking a variety of Phoenician languages instead of Romance languages in Europe. But the Romans won. It was a huge titanic struggle for like 200 years. The Romans won it after a series of extraordinary military manoeuvres and naval battles, and then they mainly were fighting Carthage, which was the great colony that the Phoenicians had founded in North Africa, close to what is now Tunis. And the Carthaginians were pretty warlike, and they lost to the Romans. And the Romans, I think personally, I wouldn't have approved of it, but they sacked the entire city and burned the entire thing down, and we lost all the Phoenician books and writings. That's why we only have fragments of their philosophies and religions. I think that's an act of cultural barbarism that the Romans did. I wouldn't have, if I'd had anything to do with it, I would have stopped that, because all those works have gone up in flames. I mean, these guys were quite intelligent, these Phoenicians, and they defeated them in war, but they could have built a museum of Phoenician studies or something and left all the library intact. But the Romans weren't that big on intellectual solutions to problems. They were more the Mussolini approach, you flatten the enemy. get the tank. It's sort of Putin-esque type style. You just flatten the enemy, bring the tanks in and bomb them. But they lived on, and Phoenician culture has been appreciated and respected, and scholars discovered the impact of Phoenician on the world. There's now Oxford University handbooks of Phoenician studies and things, which I've delved into. It's a specialist field and fascinating. And archaeologists have been, discovering new things about them all the time. Okay, so that's the Phoenicians. Now, what's that got to do with Judaism? Well, it's got quite a lot to do with Judaism, really, because the thing is that the Jewish people were inland-dwelling tribe who were Canaanites, speaking a language almost identical to Phoenician, and who learned the alphabet from them. So just as the Phoenicians taught the alphabet to the seafaring Greeks and Romans, they also taught it to the inland tribes, who were called Hebrews at that time. And the Hebrews adopted the alphabet from the Phoenicians and turned it into the Hebrew alphabet through various, many hundreds of years of evolution. And I've traced the form of the letters, shapes and stuff. What we now call modern Hebrew, if you go to Tel Aviv and read a book in Israeli Hebrew, that script is what's called square Hebrew. And that was produced in about the 500s BC. And it became the standard alphabet in use in the Persian Empire, which is why it became the standard thing. And that's what most Bibles are printed with, using that. But the first Hebrew alphabet was much closer to original Phoenician. And it was, there are some texts that have come down using that older script. And interestingly, because we're looking at Samaritans here, they're a branch of what you could call Old Judaism. They have claims to be the oldest type of Judaism that exists, right? Because their Bible, I don't have a Samaritan Bible, I wish I did. I mean, please, if somebody's got one, send me one, right? The Samaritan Bible is printed or written in Old Hebrew, which writing is very similar to Old Phoenician. And I believe some of the writing is slightly different. I would love to get my hands on a Samaritan Bible and check out exactly the differences. I'd love to see one with footnotes and a scholarly edition of the Samaritan Bible, right? I've never found one. I don't know that anyone, surely somebody's done this, but I haven't had time to track it down. The thing is, the Samaritans, there's only a few hundred, really, of them left. It says, actually, there's 654 full-on Samaritans left in the world. That's not a lot of people. They wear white, they have great big tall hats, and they guard their scriptures. That's probably why scholars haven't been allowed to copy one of their Samaritan Bibles. They exist in the state of Israel. They accept the fact that Israel has turned up, and all these people that call themselves Jews have appeared. The Samaritans don't really regard these Jews as authentic Jews. They say they just came in from Russia, and they've emigrated here because it's a good deal, it's nice weather, and they're driving their fast cars around Tel Aviv. But they're not actually Jews or proper Hebrews, say the Samaritans. We are the original people. They also don't even accept Jerusalem as the spiritual capital of Judaism. Now that's interesting because everyone thinks, Judaism, oh yeah, Jerusalem, right? But no, the Samaritans predate all that. And they say that when Moses brought, the people back out of exile in Egypt, he settled, or he didn't ever get back, he never got to the Promised Land, but under his successor Joshua, the tribes were settled in a region north of Jerusalem, near a place called Shechem, and that this is the spiritual capital of Judaism. And that's where the Samaritans are based. And it's close to two big mountains where they go and do their rituals and things. I suspend judgment in this war between Jerusalem and Shechem. I think it's very interesting that the Samaritan narrative has never been completely lost. And I think it's very important historically, you know, that it should be studied and affirmed and listened to. The other thing that's interesting from a scholarly peace perspective is that even in Jesus' time, when he was around, nearly, 2,000 years ago, there was tension between the Jewish people who affirm Jerusalem as the centre of the universe and their God lives on the holy mountain and all that, and the Samaritans who said, you've got to be kidding, God is actually on our mountain, you know, dozens of miles north of Jerusalem. That God in Jerusalem is a sort of fake God. He's the God of the state, politics, David and Solomon, you know, the kings. He's the king God. Whereas ours is the real God, up in the mountains. Now that tension already existed at the time of Jesus, right? We know that from the writings, because Jesus was unusual in that he was Jewish, but he was prepared to talk to Samaritans as if they were real human beings. And he didn't demonize them. And we all know the parable, if you've had even the slightest bit of Christian religious education, we've all heard the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's a story of someone that was on a road, on a journey, who gets attacked by robbers, and he's severely beaten up. They steal his donkey and all his gold and silver or whatever, and they leave him to die on the road. He's got bruises all over his eyes and face and bleeding and so on and so on. They just leave him to die. And a succession of people pass by. The rich guy hurrying to the temple in Jerusalem, you know, great rabbi, he just looks at him, he's almost dead, can't be bothered, goes on, you know. Then somebody else comes, it's a rich merchant type, can't be bothered, well, me help that guy, I mean, God, you know, he's got flies buzzing around his eyes, I'm not going, you know. And then finally, after a succession of them passed by, a Samaritan stops, sees what's happened, takes pity on the guy. He doesn't ask, you know, are you Jewish, are you Samaritan, are you a pagan, are you what are you? He doesn't ask, just a human, right? So he actually binds up what he can, he cleans the wounds, and he makes some simple bandages, and then he takes him to the local town on his donkey and then pays for him to have a room for a week and asks them to look after him. And Jesus tells that parable. It's in all the Gospels, so we know this must have been something he actually said. To mean, and this was in response to the question of who is my neighbour. Somebody asked him in the crowd, so what's a neighbour then, Jesus? You're so clever. How do you define a neighbour then? Because he said you have to love your neighbour as you love yourself, which was quite strong stuff. You know, love my neighbour, you know. So then how do you define the neighbour? So Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, meaning even Samaritans can be your neighbour if they do good. Jesus ends that parable by saying, well, do you think, who was the true neighbour to the guy that was beaten up? Was it the guys that passed by, or was it the Samaritan? You know, obviously it was the Samaritan. So that's really interesting, because Jesus obviously, his understanding of spirituality transcended these narrow divisions or sectarianism between, you know, I'm Jewish or I'm Samaritan. No, we're all humans, he was saying, and we should love each other equally. So that's a clue. So Jesus went to Sechem. There's a few interesting events took place there. He meets a woman at a well who interrogates him and says, you know, who are you? And he answers by telling her about her life. You know, like he lists all the husbands she's had and all that, and she says, "What? Can you read my mind?" You know, and he was obviously showing off his telepathic abilities. And she wasn't quite expecting this. She runs to the local village of Samaritans to go and get other people come, and she said, "I think I found the Messiah. I mean, there's some kind of miracle worker turned up. I think you should come and meet him." So that's another interesting clue, that Jesus was known, loved and respected among the Samaritan community. Because I think Jesus was reading from a script, the Enochian script, Enoch 1 and 2, secret books, which were intended for all people. Not even just the Jews, but the Samaritans as well. But not even just that, they were intended for the Celts and the Romans and the Greeks, for all humanity. We were all to be set free from sin and suffering and ignorance. And he was the guy who was going to do this. He wasn't going to be the king of Israel. He was going to be the king of the earth, like a Dharma king or Dharma Raja. That was the script Jesus was running from, I think. And so he had friends, disciples among the Samaritan community, and that's interesting. I don't know if there's any still left. I mean, I'm not sure who at the moment are the most important Samaritan scholars on the planet. I haven't managed to track them down. I'm sure there are a few hidden away, and they would verify what I'm saying. Okay, so so there's a connection here. I mean, I think history is full of these broken conversations for goodness, which get swamped by the conversations for violence. You know, Christ was trying to have a peace conversation with Samaritans and Jews, all included, but was prevented from finishing the conversation. You know, I've always said that instead of crucifying Jesus and arresting him for blasphemy, his only blasphemy was to try and talk peace and love to people, you know, which of course threatened the state and the army and the Roman Empire and the whole empire of lies on which it was based, and slavery and the whole works, right? He was like a radical peace philosopher, threatening all that, so the system killed him. Now, which didn't stop the message, because the message had been so powerfully delivered it got out anyway. But it did distort the message. And we got churchianity instead of the pure energy love stream that Christ wanted. And I, you know, if I'd have had any say in the matter, if I'd have been in, you know, any way of tinkering with history or kind of invent a time machine and go back, instead of crucifying Jesus, I would have given him a professorship at the Samaritan University of Jerusalem and let him share his wisdom and let people come, like set up a philosophy club, you know, and that's all he wanted, was to try and teach people to be better. It's all philosophers all want. And anyway, it didn't happen. Okay, so that's the Samaritan thing. The Karaites, which are also in box 42, they're another stream of Judaism that are also very interesting. The mainstream Orthodox Jews regard them as heretics. But the Karaites say, actually, it's the other way around. The Karaites are a lineage of Jewish savants, active since the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries AD and even before, who don't accept the Talmud, which is the books after the Bible. If I want to train as a rabbi in London, I go to Jewish College, or in New York, and I go to the Jewish seminary, I have to study all the Bible, you know, master it, understand what it's about. And then I have to study the Talmud, which is a huge, many volume work. I mean, I've studied the Talmud, and it's really complicated. And it consists of discussions between rabbis over about 400 or 500 years of history, after Christ's time, or starting around when he was around, and then going on down to about 500 AD. And they discuss everything in fine detail, mostly from a legalistic perspective. There would be whole chapters on, if you're going down the road and you see someone who's been beaten up, do you have the right to stop? Do you have the duty to stop? How much help should you give? Should you just pay for one night or 2 nights at the end? Or is it under what circumstances is it okay to pass by and do nothing? And you would get discussions by rabbis saying, some rabbis would say, you should always stop. If you see somebody in distress, always stop. Others would say, well, No, don't stop if there might be other robbers lurking about in the hills, because maybe whoever did that is going to come and get you. So actually it's safer if you have a family to look after and you're hurrying on back home. You should hurry on back home, preserve your life, because that guy's a goner already. So instead of seeing 2 people die, it will be better that at least you survive. So if there's any doubt and you think there might be robbers still hiding, then hurry on by. I know it's bad, but that's what you've got to do to safeguard, you know, the life force. And then there would be discussions. Some other rabbi would say, yeah, but how do you know if there's other robbers hiding? How can you tell? And another rabbi would say, well, you look for the shadows behind the rocks. If you see a shadow move, you know it's time to clear out. But what if the shadow is just a tree branch blowing in the wind? Well, you should wait 3 minutes and see how much it moves, because you'll be able to tell if it's a tree branch. What if I wait 3.5 minutes? No, you shouldn't do that. Just stay the 3 minutes. And then some other rabbi says, why don't you just walk behind the stone and see if there's somebody hiding behind the boulder? And someone else will say, no, that's too complicated. That's risky, because if there is somebody hiding there and they've got a knife or a sword, then that's you, you're done. And so on and so on and so on. So the Talmud is this incredible long conversation between all these unbelievably intelligent rabbis, dissecting every little aspect of life. Like it deals with fasting, diet, marriage, you know, what happens when somebody dies, burial customs, everything you need to run a community. And that's why the rabbis study all this stuff. And it doesn't ever give a clear answer. It doesn't say, and this is what you must do. It says, this is what this rabbi said. This is what this rabbi said. This is what this rabbi said. Now it's up to you to decide what you're going to do in 20th century New York based on their conversations. Because you could take a discussion like that about the Samaritan guy, and you could then transfer it to the streets of New York where there's a mugging. You're driving past, you can see the mugging's just happened. Should you stop? Should you get out of your car? You're in a dangerous part of New York. When would it be appropriate to stop, get out and help the guy who's wounded? Or should you just drive on a bit and call 911 on your cell phone, you know? So that's why for rabbis in the 20th century it's useful to study the Talmud. Okay, however, the Karaites are very strict. They say all that is just, you know, is not divine. Yes, it's interesting, and there's no harm in reading all that stuff, but it doesn't come from God. We, the proper Jews, the Karaites, we build our faith on the words of God, which are in the actual Bible, the Torah, which is the first 5 books of Moses. All the other stuff is just like commentary, and to be a proper Jew, you have to just study the first 5 books of Moses, they say. And they say that the rabbis who are then using the Talmud to justify their authority. So right now the chief rabbi of Israel is a Talmud-trained scholar. And if you go now to Israel and study in rabbinical college, that's what you learn, right? Well, the Karaites just cut through all that and say that's just like a waste of time. I mean, they would say that if you're going on a round trip around Europe, you should take a guidebook, like Europe for the backpacker, you know, which tells you about what to expect in Amsterdam and Berlin and all that. They would say that the rabbis studying the Talmud are like people that are picking up bus tickets and train tickets off the station floor